July 16th, 1945. 5:29 a.m., Jornada del Muerto, New Mexico. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer stood in the control bunker, fingers gripping the edge of a wooden observation slit as countdown numbers echoed through speaker systems, connecting scattered observation posts across the desert. 10 miles away, atop a 100-foot steel tower, the gadget, humanity's first atomic weapon, waited in darkness. The theoretical physicist who had spent 3 years transforming equations into industrial reality felt his hands trembling. Not from fear of failure, though that possibility haunted every scientist present. Not from excitement at scientific breakthrough, though they stood moments away from validating theories that rewrote physics. His hands trembled because he understood, with terrible clarity unavailable to military observers or even most of his own scientists, that the world was about to change in ways from which there could be no return. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The line from the Bhagavad Gita, ancient Sanskrit text he had studied years earlier, surfaced unbidden in his consciousness. At the time, reading Hindu philosophy in the original language seemed an intellectual indulgence. Now, in this moment between the old world and something unknown, the words carried weight that transcended academic interest. The countdown reached 0. What happened next defied every expectation, every calculation, every theoretical prediction that had seemed so confident on paper. The flash, not the yellow-white of chemical explosives, but something else entirely, a light that seemed to contain every color simultaneously, transformed night into something beyond day. Brighter than 1,000 suns, the fireball expanded with speed that seemed to violate natural law. In the first millisecond, temperatures at ground zero exceeded those at the sun's core. Steel vaporized. Sand fused into radioactive glass. The shock wave that followed, traveling faster than sound, arrived at the observation bunker with force that shook, reinforced concrete, and rattled equipment assumed to be safely positioned. The mushroom cloud rising above the desert floor climbed to 40,000 feet in minutes, a pillar of fire and smoke visible from 200 miles away, photographed by cameras whose shutters captured images that would define an era. The scientists watching through dark welding glass stood silent. No cheering, no celebration. The successful demonstration of theories they had labored over for years produced not triumph, but something closer to horror at what human intelligence had wrought. Kenneth Bainbridge, test director who had managed the technical aspects of detonation, turned to Oppenheimer in the shocked silence. His words, recorded by multiple witnesses, captured what many felt but few articulated. "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer said nothing. The trembling in his hands had stopped. His face, described by observers as drained of color despite the continuing glow from ground zero, showed the expression of a man who had just completed a task from which there could be no absolution, only consequences. The mathematics that had seemed so elegant in Berkeley seminars, the physics that had fascinated brilliant minds in university laboratories, the equations that transformed abstract theory into industrial process, all of it had just become this: a weapon of such destructive power that its existence changed the fundamental calculations of warfare, diplomacy, and human survival. The Trinity test succeeded beyond engineering specifications. It worked exactly as Oppenheimer's team had calculated. That success would haunt its creator for the remaining 22 years of his life, transforming the celebrated physicist into something more complex, a Prometheus who brought fire to humanity and spent decades questioning whether the gift was curse or salvation. The flash at Trinity represented the culmination of the Manhattan Project, the largest scientific and industrial undertaking in human history. At its peak, the project employed 130,000 people across 3 secret cities and dozens of smaller sites. It cost $2 billion. approximately 30 billion in modern currency, spent without congressional appropriation or public knowledge. It brought together the greatest scientific minds of a generation to solve problems that existed purely in theory. And it produced, in just 3 years, weapons that would kill over 200,000 people in 2 Japanese cities and establish the framework for global politics that persists 8 decades later. But this story is not primarily about the bomb, though the bomb dominates historical memory. This is the story of how J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist of uncommon brilliance and complicated character, led a scientific effort of unprecedented scale, then spent the rest of his life grappling with what he had created. It is about the transformation of a man who loved physics with pure intellectual passion into someone who understood that knowledge carries moral weight, that scientific achievement can produce outcomes divorced from intention, and that some discoveries cannot be undiscovered regardless of regret. The roots of Oppenheimer's journey toward Trinity and beyond reach back to April 1943, when he arrived at Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build a laboratory in desert wilderness and recruit scientists for work they could not yet understand. The intellectual transformation, Berkeley to Los Alamos, Jazz. Robert Oppenheimer in 1942 represented everything the U.S. Army typically avoided in selecting leaders for critical military projects. At 38 years old, the theoretical physicist had never managed anything larger than a university research group. His administrative experience consisted of overseeing graduate students at Berkeley and Caltech. His politics leaned left, with documented attendance at meetings sympathetic to communist causes. His personal life was complicated. A girlfriend who had been a Communist Party member, a wife whose previous husband had been a party member killed fighting for communists in Spain. Security officers reviewing his file for clearance identified dozens of red flags that should have disqualified him from any classified project, let alone direction of America's most secret weapons program. Yet General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, chose Oppenheimer to lead the scientific effort. Groves, a military engineer who had overseen construction of the Pentagon, was not sentimental about scientific genius. He needed someone who could transform theoretical physics into working weapons under impossible deadlines. After interviewing candidates, Groves concluded that Oppenheimer possessed unique qualities that transcended his liabilities. In a 1954 security hearing that would destroy Oppenheimer's career, Groves testified about his decision. "He's a genius, a real genius. While Lawrence is very bright, he's not a genius, just a good hard worker. Why, Oppenheimer knows about everything. He can talk to you about anything you bring up." Well, not exactly. I guess there are a few things he doesn't know about. He doesn't know anything about sports. That intellectual range proved critical. The Manhattan Project required coordinating chemists, metallurgists, engineers, explosives experts, mathematicians, and physicists across multiple disciplines. Oppenheimer could speak the language of each specialty, understand their problems, and synthesize solutions that bridged theoretical purity and engineering reality. Robert Serber, Oppenheimer's former student who joined him at Los Alamos, described his mentor's intellectual process in memoir published decades later. Oppie had a way of cutting through complexity to identify the essential problem. In discussions that wandered through technical details, he would suddenly interrupt with a question that refocused everything. He saw connections between different approaches that weren't obvious to specialists. That ability to synthesize across disciplines made him perfect for Los Alamos, where success required integrating solutions from chemistry, physics, metallurgy, and engineering into a single device. But Oppenheimer brought more than intellectual range. He possessed charisma that inspired loyalty among scientists accustomed to academic independence. Los Alamos at its peak housed some of the most accomplished scientists in the world. Nobel laureates like Fermi, brilliant theoreticians like Bethe, experimentalists like Alvarez. These were not men who followed orders meekly. They followed Oppenheimer because he earned their respect through scientific competence and demonstrated care for their concerns. The Los Alamos he built reflected his vision of how science should operate. Against military preference for rigid hierarchy and compartmentalized information, Oppenheimer insisted on weekly colloquia where scientists shared progress across divisions. Security officers objected that such openness violated need-to-know principles. Oppenheimer argued that scientific progress required cross-pollination of ideas, that limiting information would slow the work more than security breaches might compromise it. He won the argument, creating an intellectual environment where theoretical physicists learned about metallurgy problems and chemists contributed to weapon design discussions. Physicist Hans Bethe, who directed the theoretical division, later reflected on Oppenheimer's leadership in the laboratory. He did not direct from the head office. He was intellectually and even physically present at each decisive step. He was present in the laboratory or in the seminar rooms, when a new effect was measured, when a new idea was conceived. It was not that he contributed so many ideas or suggestions. He did so sometimes, but his main influence came from something else. It was his continuous and intense presence which produced a sense of direct participation in all of us. The moral awakening. From theory to reality. The transformation from pure scientist to conflicted creator began not at Trinity, but in the months leading to it, as Oppenheimer watched abstract equations become industrial processes designed for mass death. In early 1943, when Oppenheimer recruited scientists to Los Alamos, he sold them on scientific challenge. The physics required to create sustained nuclear reaction, the engineering needed to compress plutonium into critical mass, the chemistry of separating uranium isotopes. These were fascinating problems that engaged brilliant minds. The purpose, killing people more efficiently than conventional weapons, remained secondary to intellectual achievement. By 1945, as the bomb neared completion, that separation became impossible to maintain. Charlotte Serber, wife of Robert Serber and librarian at Los Alamos, witnessed the psychological transition affecting scientists throughout the laboratory. Her memoir described the changing atmosphere. In 1943, people worked with excitement at solving unprecedented problems. By 1945, as success became certain, that excitement was increasingly mixed with something else. People started asking questions they had avoided earlier. How would the bomb be used? Against whom? Would it be demonstrated first? Would there be warning? The abstract weapon was becoming real, and reality brought moral weight. Oppenheimer felt that weight acutely. His correspondence in late 1944 and early 1945 showed a man struggling with implications of his work. In letters to friends outside the project, he wrote circumspectly about interesting technical challenges while hinting at deeper concerns. To his former teacher, physicist Isidore Rabi, he wrote in March 1945, "The thing is so large and so terrible that many of us are hoping it will never be used, even as we work to perfect it." The formation of the Interim Committee in May 1945 to advise President Truman on use of atomic weapons brought moral questions into sharp focus. Oppenheimer served on the scientific panel alongside Arthur Compton, Enrico Fermi, and Ernest Lawrence. Their task: recommend whether to demonstrate the weapon before use against Japan or employ it without warning. The committee deliberated against background of continuing Pacific War casualties. Okinawa campaign had cost 50,000 American casualties and 100,000 Japanese military deaths, plus perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed in fighting. Military planners projected that invasion of Japan's home islands would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties, plus millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. Against such projections, using the atomic bomb to shock Japan into surrender seemed almost merciful. Yet Oppenheimer and his colleagues understood that crossing the nuclear threshold carried consequences beyond immediate military necessity. Once used, atomic weapons would exist not as theoretical possibility, but as demonstrated reality. The precedent would be set. Future conflicts would occur in worlds where nuclear weapons were not hypothetical deterrents, but proven instruments of war. After extensive discussion, the scientific panel recommended that the bomb be used against Japan without prior demonstration. Their reasoning, captured in written report to the interim committee, reflected tortured logic of scientists trying to minimize harm while acknowledging the weapon's reality. They argued that a demonstration on an uninhabited island might fail to convince Japanese leadership, that warning would allow Americans' prisoners to be moved to target cities, that the only way to prevent a catastrophic nuclear arms race was to demonstrate the weapon's horror so completely that nations would recoil from future use. Oppenheimer signed that recommendation. He would spend the rest of his life questioning whether he had been right. The duality, pride and horror. The Trinity test crystallized Oppenheimer's internal contradiction. The successful detonation represented his greatest scientific achievement. Validation of 3 years' work, vindication of theories against engineering reality, proof that human intelligence could unlock power previously reserved to stars. Yet that same success produced the weapon that would incinerate 2 cities and introduce existential threat to human civilization. Eyewitness accounts of Oppenheimer immediately after Trinity describe a man experiencing emotional extremes simultaneously. General Thomas Farrell, Groves' deputy, watched Oppenheimer's reaction from the control bunker. His official report captured the moment. Dr. Oppenheimer, on whom had rested a very heavy burden, grew tenser as the last seconds ticked off. He scarcely breathed. He held on to a post to steady himself. For the last few seconds, he stared directly ahead, and then, when the announcer shouted, "Now!" and there came this tremendous burst of light followed shortly thereafter by the deep growling roar of the explosion, his face relaxed into an expression of tremendous relief. Relief, but not joy. Isidore Rabi, who had traveled to witness the test despite declining to work on the project, observed Oppenheimer's demeanor in hours following the detonation. "I'll never forget his walk. I'll never forget the way he stepped out of the car. His walk was like high noon, this kind of strut. He had done it." That strut, that moment of pride, coexisted with growing dread. Within hours of Trinity, Oppenheimer was already expressing concerns to colleagues about what they had created. To Kenneth Bainbridge, he agreed with the sons of bitches assessment. To visiting dignitaries, he spoke about the weapon's significance for future of warfare. To himself, in the solitude of the desert night, he grappled with implications that transcended military utility. The psychological complexity deepened when Oppenheimer traveled to Washington in late July to brief Secretary of War Henry Stimson on Trinity results. The meeting occurred days before Truman authorized use of atomic bombs against Japan. Stimson asked Oppenheimer directly whether the weapon would end the war. Oppenheimer responded affirmatively, describing the destructive power demonstrated at Trinity in terms that left no doubt about consequences. After the meeting, Oppenheimer encountered physicist Leo Szilard, who had been circulating a petition among Manhattan Project scientists urging that the bomb not be used against Japanese cities without warning. Szilard asked Oppenheimer to support the petition or at least present it to decision-makers. Oppenheimer declined, explaining that military and political authorities were best positioned to make such decisions. Scientists had fulfilled their role by creating the weapon. Its use was beyond their purview. That position, that scientists bore responsibility for creating knowledge but not for controlling its application, represented conventional thinking within the scientific community. It would not survive contact with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Reckoning, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 6, 1945. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The weapon detonated at 8:15 a.m. local time, 1,900 feet above the city center, releasing energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees, instantly vaporizing everything within a half-mile radius. The blast wave that followed destroyed buildings across 5 square miles. Thermal radiation caused severe burns up to 2 miles from ground zero. Approximately 70,000 people died immediately. Another 70,000 died by year's end from radiation exposures and injuries. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, destroyed Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 immediately and another 40,000 by year's end. News of Hiroshima reached Los Alamos hours after the Dawn attack. The reaction among scientists split along lines that would define post-war nuclear debates. Some celebrated. The weapon worked as designed, the war would end, American lives would be saved. Others reacted with horror at the scale of destruction, the targeting of civilian population, the precedent established. Oppenheimer's reaction captured both extremes. When the official announcement reached Los Alamos, he appeared at an impromptu assembly of laboratory staff. Physicist Philip Morrison, who attended, described the scene decades later. Oppenheimer came out and there was tremendous excitement and noise, and he tried to quiet the group down and make a statement. But everybody was cheering and yelling. His statement was fairly incoherent. You could see that he was a man in agony. That agony intensified over following days as reports from Hiroshima revealed the weapon's effects on human beings. The technical success, the bomb worked precisely as calculations predicted, was undeniable. But the human cost, translated from abstract casualty projections into photographs and survivor testimony, transformed scientific achievement into moral catastrophe. Robert Wilson, physicist who had led research on the bomb's implosion mechanism, articulated what many scientists felt in weeks after Hiroshima. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on the contradiction. The day after Hiroshima, I thought, my God, what have we done? But at the same time, there was this other feeling. It worked. There was a sense of accomplishment. We had done something that no one thought could be done. We had proved theories that were just equations 3 years earlier. That feeling of scientific achievement coexisted with horror at what that achievement meant. Oppenheimer experienced that contradiction with particular intensity. In October 1945, he met with President Truman at the White House. The meeting went badly. Oppenheimer told Truman, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, according to multiple accounts, was irritated by the physicist's guilt. After Oppenheimer left, Truman reportedly told Dean Acheson, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again. He didn't drop the bomb, I did. That kind of weepiness makes me sick." But Oppenheimer's weepiness, as Truman dismissed it, reflected something deeper than personal weakness. It represented awakening to moral implications that transcended individual responsibility. The bomb existed now. Knowledge could not be erased. Future wars would occur in a world where nuclear weapons were available to any nation with sufficient industrial capacity and scientific expertise. Oppenheimer understood, earlier and more clearly than most, that the atomic bomb was not simply another weapon but something fundamentally different, a technology that could end civilization. The Advocate, post-war arms control. After Los Alamos closed and scientists returned to universities, Oppenheimer emerged as the most prominent voice advocating for international control of atomic energy. In speeches, articles, and testimony before Congress, he argued that preventing nuclear war required unprecedented international cooperation, that nations must subordinate sovereignty to collective survival. In a November 1945 speech at Los Alamos before the laboratory's closure, Oppenheimer laid out his vision with characteristic eloquence. If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world, or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The peoples of this world must unite, or they will perish. This war that has ravaged so much of the earth has written these words. The atomic bomb has spelled them out for all men to understand. He advocated for the Baruch Plan, a U.S. proposal to place all atomic energy development under international authority. The plan required nations to surrender sovereignty over nuclear technology to a United Nations agency that would prevent military applications while promoting peaceful uses. It was idealistic, perhaps naively so, requiring trust between nations that had just completed the most destructive war in history and were already sliding into Cold War antagonism. The Soviet Union rejected the Baruch Plan, viewing it as an American attempt to maintain nuclear monopoly under guise of international control. The Soviets were already racing to develop their own atomic bomb, using intelligence gathered from spies within the Manhattan Project and captured German scientists. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon in August 1949, ending American nuclear monopoly years ahead of Western predictions, Oppenheimer's hope for international control died. The Soviet test triggered debate within American government about developing the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon thousands of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Edward Teller, physicist who had worked at Los Alamos and felt constrained by the focus on fission weapons, had been advocating for a crash program to develop fusion weapons since 1945. The Soviet atomic test gave his arguments urgency that overcame scientific and moral objections. Oppenheimer opposed the hydrogen bomb with arguments both technical and moral. As chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, he led effort to convince President Truman that pursuing thermonuclear weapons was strategically unnecessary and morally indefensible. In a report to the President in October 1949, the GAC argued that hydrogen bombs offered no military advantage sufficient to justify their development, that their destructive power was so extreme that no conceivable military target would require them, and that their development would accelerate the arms race toward levels of destructiveness that served no rational purpose. The report included a famous minority annex, signed by Fermi and Rabi, but reflecting Oppenheimer's views. The fact that no limits exist to the destructiveness of this weapon makes its very existence and the knowledge of its construction a danger to humanity as a whole. It is necessarily an evil thing considered in any light. For these reasons, we believe it important for the President of the United States to tell the American public and the world that we think it wrong on fundamental ethical principles to initiate the development of such a weapon. Truman ignored the recommendation. In January 1950, he authorized the hydrogen bomb program. Soviet Union followed with its own thermonuclear program. By 1952, the United States had tested the first hydrogen bomb. By 1953, the Soviets had followed. The arms race Oppenheimer had feared was fully underway, escalating beyond fission weapons to thermonuclear arsenals, capable of destroying civilization multiple times over. The Persecution Security Hearing. Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb, combined with his left-wing political associations in the 1930s and his continuing advocacy for arms control, made him target for anti-communist investigations sweeping America in the early 1950s. In December 1953, William Borden, former executive director of the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy, sent a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover making explosive allegations. More probably than not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is an agent of the Soviet Union. The accusation was absurd. Oppenheimer had no access to classified information after leaving government advisory roles, had never been charged with security violations during the Manhattan Project, and had devoted post-war career to preventing nuclear war rather than enabling Soviet military advantage. But in McCarthy-era America, the accusation alone was sufficient to trigger investigation. The Atomic Energy Commission, under political pressure, suspended Oppenheimer's security clearance and convened a hearing to determine whether it should be reinstated. The hearing, conducted in April and May 1954, became a trial of not merely Oppenheimer's loyalty, but his judgment, his associations, his political views, and his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. The proceedings exposed the man's complexity and contradictions in painful detail. Witnesses testified about his communist associations in the 1930s, his relationship with John Tatlock, a Communist Party member and former girlfriend who had committed suicide in 1944, his wife's communist connections, his attendance at party meetings and fundraisers. They questioned his honesty about these associations, pointing to inconsistencies in his testimony over the years. More damaging were attacks on his judgment. Edward Teller, called as a witness, delivered testimony that devastated Oppenheimer's defense. Asked whether Oppenheimer posed a security risk, Teller responded with calculated ambiguity. In a great number of cases I've seen Dr. Oppenheimer act. I understood that Dr. Oppenheimer acted in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him in numerous issues, and his actions frankly appeared to me confused and complicated. To this extent, I feel that I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better, and therefore trust more. When asked directly if he believed Oppenheimer was disloyal, Teller equivocated. I do not want to suggest any kind of disloyalty. I think it is a question of wisdom and judgment. But the damage was done. Teller's testimony, coming from a colleague and fellow physicist, gave credibility to allegations that Oppenheimer's judgment was sufficiently flawed to justify stripping his security clearance. The hearing's conclusion was predetermined. In June 1954, the three-member panel voted 2-1 to deny Oppenheimer's security clearance, citing his associations, his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, and his susceptibility to influence. The decision destroyed Oppenheimer's influence in government science policy and marked him publicly as security risk. The hearing traumatized Oppenheimer profoundly. Friends described a man whose confidence and intellectual vitality seemed to drain away, replaced by melancholy that never fully lifted. Freeman Dyson, physicist who knew Oppenheimer in later years, observed the transformation. The hearing broke something in him. Before, he had been this commanding presence, intellectually vibrant, engaged with ideas and people. After, there was a sadness, a withdrawal. He continued working, writing, teaching. But the fire was gone. The legacy. Prometheus bound. Oppenheimer's final years were spent largely in academic contemplation at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where he served as director until 1966. He wrote on physics, philosophy, the relationship between science and society. He gave lectures on the ethical responsibilities of scientists in the nuclear age. He received honors from universities and foreign governments recognizing his contributions to physics and to ending World War II. But he never escaped the shadow of what he had created. In interviews conducted late in his life, Oppenheimer returned repeatedly to themes of responsibility, regret, and the irreversibility of knowledge. Asked in a 1965 television interview whether the Manhattan Project was worthwhile, he gave an answer that captured his lifelong ambivalence. The atomic bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond there is a different country. If we are to survive and if we are to flourish, there's going to have to be some major change in the whole structure of international relations. When asked if he had regrets, he responded with characteristic complexity. I don't regret that we built the bomb when we did. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that we live in a world where such weapons can exist and nations believe they need them. But given the world we were in, given the war we were fighting, I would make the same decisions again. That doesn't mean I think they were right. only that they were necessary. That distinction between necessity and rightness defined Oppenheimer's moral struggle. He understood that circumstances sometimes force choices between bad options, that historical context matters, that judging past actions by present standards distorts understanding. Yet he also believed that creating weapons of mass destruction carried moral weight that transcended historical necessity, that scientists bore responsibility for consequences of their discoveries, even when those consequences were unintended. In one of his final public speeches, delivered at MIT in 1966, Oppenheimer addressed young scientists entering the field. His words carried the weight of experience that had transformed brilliant physicist into something more complex. A man who had helped create power that could end civilization and spent decades grappling with that knowledge. The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. The scientist is not responsible for the laws of nature, but it is a scientist's job to find out how these laws operate. It is the scientist's job to find ways in which these laws can serve the human will. However, it is not the scientist's job to determine whether a hydrogen bomb should be constructed, whether it should be used, or how it should be used. This responsibility rests with the American people and with their chosen representatives. Yet even as he articulated this separation between scientific discovery and political decision, Oppenheimer acknowledged its inadequacy. Scientists cannot simply discover and then wash their hands of consequences. Knowledge itself carries power. Creating tools of destruction, even for defensive purposes, changes reality in ways that transcend original intent. J. Robert Oppenheimer died on February 18, 1967, at age 62, of throat cancer likely caused by decades of chain smoking. He died having witnessed the nuclear arms race he had feared, the United States and Soviet Union stockpiling tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, deploying weapons in submarines and bombers, creating arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. The Doomsday Clock, established in 1947 to symbolize proximity to nuclear catastrophe, had moved closer to midnight. The world he had helped create was locked in Cold War where miscalculation could trigger annihilation. Yet he also died having witnessed 22 years without nuclear weapons use in warfare. Despite crises in Korea, Cuba, Berlin, and elsewhere, despite proxy wars and confrontations, despite arms race spiraling beyond rational limits, the weapons had not been used since Nagasaki. Whether through deterrence, luck, or human wisdom, the threshold Oppenheimer had feared would be crossed repeatedly had remained uncrossed. His obituaries described him as the father of the atomic bomb, a designation that carried both recognition and accusation. Friends who eulogized him emphasized his scientific achievements, his intellectual range, his contributions to ending World War II. Critics noted his role in creating weapons of mass destruction, his initial support for using atomic bombs against Japan, his work that enabled the nuclear arms race. Both perspectives captured partial truth. Oppenheimer was a brilliant scientist who made fundamental contributions to theoretical physics. He was an effective administrator who led unprecedented scientific collaboration. He was a complex man whose political associations reflected idealistic youth more than mature judgment. He was architect of weapons that killed hundreds of thousands and threatened millions more. And he was moral thinker who spent half his life grappling with implications of what he had done, advocating for arms control and warning about dangers of nuclear proliferation. The Final Reckoning. What Oppenheimer teaches us. The story of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project transcends individual biography or historical episode. It represents a fundamental transformation in human capability and human responsibility. For millennia, humans wielded power constrained by natural limits. Even the most destructive weapons, catapults, cannons, dynamite, conventional bombs, operated within scales that civilization could absorb. Nuclear weapons changed that equation fundamentally. For the first time, humans possessed power to destroy civilization itself, to render the planet uninhabitable, to end the human story. Oppenheimer understood this earlier and more clearly than most. His transformation from enthusiastic project leader to conflicted advocate for arms control reflected not personal weakness, but intellectual honesty, confronting consequences of discovery. The physics was beautiful. The engineering was elegant. The weapon was horrific. All three truths coexisted, and pretending otherwise required willful ignorance that Oppenheimer could not sustain. The question that haunted Oppenheimer, whether scientists should pursue knowledge regardless of consequences or accept responsibility for how knowledge is used, remains unresolved. The conventional answer, that scientists discover and politicians decide, breaks down when discoveries transform political possibilities. Nuclear weapons didn't simply give governments new tools, they fundamentally altered international relations, military strategy, and existential risk. Scientists who created that transformation cannot claim innocence on grounds that they merely solved equations. Yet the alternative, that scientists should refuse to pursue knowledge that might have dangerous applications, carries its own dangers. Scientific progress depends on free inquiry. Some discoveries that initially seem purely theoretical eventually enable beneficial applications. And in any case, forbidding research in one nation doesn't prevent it in others. It merely ensures that more authoritarian governments might develop dangerous technologies first. Oppenheimer navigated this dilemma imperfectly. He led the Manhattan Project because he believed Nazi Germany was pursuing atomic weapons, and that American democracy was preferable to Nazi totalitarianism as custodian of nuclear power. That judgment was sound. But once Germany surrendered in May 1945, he supported using the completed weapons against Japan on grounds that their horror might prevent future wars, a judgment that proved more ambiguous. The bombs did shock Japan into surrender, potentially saving lives that invasion would have cost. But they also established precedent for targeting civilian populations with weapons of mass destruction and triggered arms race that threatened civilization. In his final years, Oppenheimer seemed to settle on acceptance rather than resolution. He could not undo what he had done. He could not retrieve knowledge once discovered. He could only bear witness to what had been created and warn about consequences of misusing it. That role, scientific conscience speaking uncomfortable truths, became his final contribution. When the Atomic Energy Commission voted in 1963 to award Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award, recognizing his contributions to theoretical physics and to national security, President Kennedy intended it as partial rehabilitation for the humiliation of the security hearing. Kennedy's assassination prevented him from personally presenting the award. President Johnson did so in December 1963. Oppenheimer's acceptance speech was characteristically modest. He spoke about physics, about Los Alamos, about the scientists who had worked there. He did not claim personal credit or offer justifications. He simply acknowledged what had been done and expressed hope that future generations would manage nuclear technology more wisely than his generation had. That hope remains unfulfilled, but not yet abandoned. 8 decades after Hiroshima, nuclear weapons still exist in arsenals of 9 nations. The total stockpile has decreased from Cold War peaks of over 60,000 warheads to approximately 13,000 today, but even reduced numbers represent destructive power sufficient to end civilization. The possibility of nuclear war through miscalculation, accident, or deliberate use remains real. The risk of nuclear terrorism or proliferation to unstable regimes adds new dimensions to dangers Oppenheimer recognized. Yet those same 8 decades demonstrate that human beings can live with ultimate weapons without using them, can recognize mutual vulnerability, can negotiate arms control agreements, can step back from the brink repeatedly, when crises threaten to escalate. Whether through deterrence, wisdom, luck, or some combination, the weapons that Oppenheimer helped create have remained unused in warfare since 1945. That record offers cautious hope that humanity might yet learn to manage technology it is barely mature enough to possess. Oppenheimer's epitaph might be the words he spoke in 1945 at Los Alamos, before Hiroshima, when success at Trinity was fresh and implications were just beginning to register. We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon, that has altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world. We have made a thing that by all the standards of the world we grew up in is an evil thing. And by so doing we have raised again the question of whether science is good for man, whether it is good to learn about the world, whether knowledge always contributes to human welfare. The question remains open. The knowledge exists, the weapons persist, and the ghost of Robert Oppenheimer haunts every discussion of nuclear policy, every arms control negotiation, every debate about scientific responsibility. Not as villain or hero, but as complicated human being who led unprecedented scientific achievement, helped create weapons of mass destruction, then spent decades questioning whether the creation was justified and warning about consequences of misusing what had been made. History will remember J. Robert Oppenheimer as the man who led the Manhattan Project, who brought together brilliant minds to solve impossible problems, who transformed theoretical physics into weapons that ended one war and defined the next 70 years of global politics. He will be remembered for Trinity's flash and Hiroshima's destruction, for Los Alamos and for the security hearing, for his scientific achievements and his political vulnerabilities. But perhaps he should be remembered most for his honesty in confronting what he had done, for his refusal to hide behind necessity or patriotism or scientific inevitability, for his willingness to say publicly that he felt blood on his hands, and to mean it. In an age when leaders rarely admit error or express regret, when institutional forces discourage acknowledging moral complexity, Oppenheimer stood as example of intellectual who took responsibility for consequences of his work, even when those consequences transcended his intentions. The world he helped create remains dangerous. The weapons exist. The knowledge cannot be erased. Future generations will struggle with the inheritance. Power to end civilization, wisdom insufficient to guarantee restraint, hope that humanity might mature into its capabilities before those capabilities destroy it. Whether Oppenheimer was right to lead the Manhattan Project, whether the atomic bombs should have been used against Japan, whether scientists bear special responsibility for dangerous discoveries, these questions admit no simple answers, but they demand continued asking, continued grappling with implications, continued effort to align human wisdom with human power. That was Oppenheimer's final gift. Not the bomb, but the question, not the answer, but the acknowledgement that questions matter, that moral complexity deserves honest confrontation, that creating power requires accepting responsibility for its consequences. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He spoke those words at Trinity, ancient Sanskrit suddenly relevant in New Mexico desert at moment when human beings became capable of ending their own story. He carried them the rest of his life, monument to knowledge that cannot be unknown, to power that cannot be unlearned, to the burden of understanding what has been created and why it matters. The flash at Trinity lasted milliseconds. The light faded. The mushroom cloud dispersed. But the shadow remains, cast across history by the moment when theoretical physics became industrial process, when elegant equations became terrible weapons, when humanity crossed threshold from which there can be no return. Oppenheimer stands in that shadow still, brilliant and flawed, accomplished and tormented, the scientist who helped create nuclear age and spent his life warning about what he had made. History offers no simple judgment on his legacy, only acknowledgement that he led unprecedented achievement with profound consequences, that he bore responsibility with uncommon honesty, and that the questions he raised about knowledge, power, and moral responsibility remain as urgent today as in 1945 when the first atomic bomb transformed desert sand to radioactive glass and announced to the world that everything had changed. The destroyer of worlds. And the man who never stopped questioning whether that destruction was necessary, whether it was right, and what it meant for humanity's future. That questioning, that refusal to accept easy answers or hide behind necessity, might be his greatest contribution. The example of intellectual honesty confronting moral complexity at the intersection of science and human survival.